Well, now that you're all swimming in hydro, I'm going to jump in and give you something completely different. So sit back and hopefully you'll come away with something you didn't know before. So today I'm going to talk about the importance of foundations by taking a tour through some of this country's mapping history from the last 250 years. Specifically, I want to highlight the value in building durable foundations. So durable is important because you can't foresee the full value of the work we do today. So it's important to build well. I also think some historical context can inform our work on modern concerns. So we usually think of foundations in the context of buildings. However, they are equally important in all aspects of our geospatial profession. So I think it's enlightening to just take a quick review of the definition of the word foundation. The act of founding, establishing an institution, something that gives rise to or supports something else. You'll hear echoes of these phrases throughout this presentation. So the importance of mapping in government is well understood today and has been the focus of significant effort throughout our country's history. Looking back at historical mapping efforts, what stands out is how, just as today, our predecessors clearly understood the importance of four things: mapping standards, best practices, and collaborative governance. The fourth thing, which they may or may not have understood, is that when they were successful, their best results were backed by effective governance. Excuse me, let me back up. Three things: mapping standards, best practices, and what we now refer to as open data. The fourth thing, which they may or may not have understood, is that when they were successful, their best results were backed by effective governance. So when our predecessors succeeded in these four areas, they did foundational work that served our country well. What they could not have foreseen, even in their wildest dreams, was how well their work served future needs. So English settlers first arrived in what is now the United States because English monarchs wanted to expand the British Empire. They couldn't afford to fund this expansion, so they outsourced it by granting charters to land in North America to business groups and private individuals. Setting aside the fact that the land was already occupied by Native Americans, the premise of these charters was that occupancy meant ownership. These charters, or grants of rights to land, were initially defined geographically in terms of latitude and subsequently in terms of geographic features like rivers. As you can see in this graphic, the geographic extent of these charters was broad, with the coastal colonial states initially including great swaths of land to their west. As colonists arrived under these various charters, those controlling the charters could grant rights in land to colonists. This meant they needed to define who had what rights to land. Thus, surveying and mapping land were an important early occupation in colonial America. As you probably know, before he was a soldier and our first president, one of George Washington's occupations was surveyor. Unfortunately, before the Revolutionary War, except in the New England states, different state government models, no consistent land tenure system, and different methods of locating claims in land saw a growing problem with clouded land titles. This was fundamentally a problem due to lack of standards and inadequate governance. As overland travel before trains at this time of the country's history was often very difficult, when they could, people traveled by boat. Another early foundational event, this one involving governance, occurred in 1807. That was when President Thomas Jefferson created the National Geodetic Survey. Its original charge was mapping the Atlantic coastline as an aid to travel and commerce. So our earliest leaders recognized that mapping the territory was essential for effective government. You can't manage a country without knowing something about its extent, its key features, its boundaries, and its resources. Stepping back 25 years before Jefferson's presidency, after the Revolutionary War, the colonial states confiscated land of those loyal to the King of England. They also declared land without title in their western territories as state lands. Without going into the details, After a political fight tied to ratifying the Articles of Confederation, the colonial states with Western territories ceded them to the US Congress, creating large areas of unincorporated territory east of the Mississippi River. The states in Congress had lots of land, big debts, very little money, and Congress had no ability to levy taxes. Hard to believe. So both states and Congress sold land to raise money. The challenge was identifying the increments of land being sold, how to map those increments, and managing those land sales so that people had confidence in their legal title. These were serious mapping challenges for a country that was not yet 10 years old. So this challenge was the genesis of the Public Land Survey System, or PLSS. The PLSS was used in all states except in the original colonies and in West Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, Texas, and Hawaii. And as many of you know, the foundation of the PLS is survey baselines. Those baselines were then used to start dividing land into 6 mile square townships. Townships are subdivided into 36 1-mile square sections. Sections could be further subdivided into quarter sections and quarter sections into quarter sections. Some land was also set aside for schools and government. The township section range design on which the system is based drew on experience with similar systems in New England. After some politicking in Congress, the PLSS was implemented in 1785 based on mapping standards, standard tools, and clear governance, all under the direction of Thomas Hutchinson, first geographer of the United States. A system for registering land sales was also established. Incidentally, and I think regretfully, Hutchinson was also the last geographer of the United States. In reading about development of the PLSS, I can't help but think about the time involved as the individual surveyors slogged across the landscape on horseback or on foot. Their individual efforts likely seemed small, but collectively they built a foundation that has indelibly marked the landscape. While there were errors and inconsistencies in this 18th and 19th century surveying and mapping work, the collective efforts of these individual surveyors produced a foundation on which we rely to this day. The PLSS enabled Congress and the states to sell or grant land with reliable title, thus enabling the country's rapid economic development in the first 100 years of its existence. In 1803, the United States purchased the Louisiana Territory from France. Spain ceded Florida in 1819. Texas was added in 1845, followed by the Oregon Territory in 1846. And finally, a big chunk of the Southwest was ceded to the United States in 1848 as an outcome of the Mexican-American War. Thus, in the span of less than 50 years, the country tripled in size. Naturally, many different people and organizations had reason to start assessing the geographic resources we had acquired. There was lots of overlapping surveying and mapping work going on, all without any governance, oversight, or standards. The US Geological Survey was created in 1879. Their original charge was to map public lands, examine geologic structures, and evaluate mineral resources. Thus, fundamentally, and only a little over 140 years ago, the nation recognized we needed an agency whose mission was to map the country. In 1884, Congress specifically tasked the USGS with mapping what is now referred to as the lower 48 states. The lower 48 states is a large geographic area, about 3.1 million square miles and approximately 2,500 miles coast to coast. Mapping this area, making a national map, if you will, is a huge challenge. And if you tack on Alaska and Hawaii, you get 3.8 million square miles. Over just under the next 110 years, the USGS developed topographic quadrangle maps covering the country at various scales. This effort culminated in 1991 with completion of what is known as the Topographic Quadrangle Map Series at 1 to 24,000 and 1 to 25,000 scales. These maps cover the lower 48 states and represent an astonishing effort. There are 55,000 map sheets, and many of them were redone as the land was developed. Not surprisingly, these maps were hugely popular. Again, the success of this major mapping project was based on mapping standards, standard tools, and clear governance. As with the PLSS, I am mindful of the efforts of thousands of individuals as they painstakingly engraved or scribed map features, first onto copper plates and later onto Mylar map sheets. Collectively, their individual efforts produced a foundation that we still use today. The methods and tools used and developed by the USGS in their work over decades on producing paper maps deserve their own presentation. Perhaps I'll put that one together for some future NSDI conference. Not surprisingly, these methods and tools changed over the years. By the 1970s, the production method involving carefully co-registered Mylar sheets or color separates, one for each of the different feature types on the paper map. A printing negative for each map sheet was produced by shining light through the co-registered color separate sheets. This brief overview really does not begin to do justice to the painstaking, detailed work required to build this foundation. Those same color separates facilitated two key undertakings by the USGS in 1970 as part of transitioning from paper and analog methods to digital. First was developing digital line graphs, or DLGs, by digitizing existing maps. These vector files of individual map layers were initially from the 1 to 100,000 scale map series. By the late 1980s, the DLGs were being sourced from the individual color separates for the 1 to 24,000 and 1 to 25,000 scale topoquads. The second undertaking used advances in photogrammetry and orthophotography to produce digital elevation models. The DLGs preserved decades of investment in paper maps, and combined with the DEMs were important contributions to a new digital foundation for mapping. In the 1960s, the Census Bureau developed the Geographic Base Files, or GBF, and the Dual Independent Map Encoding, or DIME data model. In the DIME model, intersections, streets, and blocks were classified as the now familiar point, line, and polygon feature types. The GBF DIME files were used for the 1970 National Census. While they were developed for a specific need, as they followed a standard and were freely available, they enabled a variety of other activity, including what went on to become a major business sector. Some of you probably remember Geographic Data Technologies and its founder, Don Cook. Descendants of GDT and other companies from that time are among NSDIC's sponsors. The foundational value of the Census Bureau's GBF DIME files and the USGS DLGs were extended further, as both were an essential source for creating the US Census Tiger files developed for the 2000 National Census. Incidentally, the USGS DLGs and DEMs, along with the Census Tiger files, were sources for key parts of MassGIS's database in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Jumping ahead to more recent times, foundational work on standards has continued. These days, we take web mapping services for granted. The Open Geospatial Consortium, or OGC, was established by the geospatial industry over 30 years ago. Their foundational standards took years to develop, and that work continues today. Here you see the OGC's web mapping service standard in action. This is a basic get map request with its result. If you look at the details, the request is surprisingly simple. Nonetheless, it represents a complex standards development effort. We also have a national address data standard, or rather two of them. The first is the FGDC Thoroughfare Landmark and Postal Address Data Standard, developed by ERISA and NINA. And the second is the Civic Location Data Exchange Format, or CLDXF, standard developed by NINA for the Next Generation 911 work. In this case, the joke about, I love standards, I especially love that there's so many to choose from, hits a little too close to home. On a more serious note, those standards are very closely aligned, differing only in details impacting specific use cases, and are an important foundation for our work today on the National Address Database. Foundational work is not, of course, unique to the federal government nor national organizations. While I'm not familiar with initiatives in other states, I'm sure there are historical and modern examples of how standards and governance have laid foundations that are contributing or will contribute to our national spatial data infrastructure. Here's a couple of examples from Massachusetts. These graphics are drawn from work around 1900 by a Massachusetts government body called the Harbor and Lands Commission. The commission published a 68-volume atlas set that is the survey-based authoritative record of municipal boundaries in Massachusetts. We're very fortunate to have this record. The record for each municipality consists of a written description of the boundary, a table listing the coordinates for the boundary monuments that define each municipality's boundaries, a triangulation map showing the higher order control monuments to which each boundary monument is triangulated, and a description and a map of each monument's location to facilitate recovery in the field. The atlas is another example of how a well-laid mapping foundation enabled later success that our ancestors could not have foreseen. Here's the same boundary featured in the last graphic, now represented online in one of our mapping applications. Massachusetts' work on standards has also been important. First published in 2002, our parcel standard and subsequent versions was developed in collaboration with stakeholders, including, most importantly, stakeholders in local government. That collaboration with local government stakeholders has been key to the standard's success. When we created that standard, we had no idea when we might get traction on standardized parcel mapping, but we knew that it was an essential part of the foundation. So my intent in providing this selective tour of national and state mapping history is to see what we can learn from history about building geospatial foundations. As you've heard, building those foundations has been a national challenge throughout our country's history. There have been successes. They involved the collective efforts of individuals who were implementing standards and best practices, as well as effective governance. We can draw from history as we work on our modern concern of the National Spatial Data Infrastructure. Besides the familiar framework data layers and metadata, the key elements in the NSDI are making data available through a clearinghouse and developing standards and partnerships. The vision for the NSDI is that we build the data once and then make it readily available to everyone. However, besides the well-understood need for standards and best practices, the vision behind the NSDI requires us to solve a very difficult problem: getting different levels of government to work together toward a collective benefit. This is not a new problem. A 1906 presidential executive order directed the US Geographic Board to, quote, review mapping projects to avoid duplication and to facilitate standardized mapping. 1906. More recently, in 2015, the General Accounting Office confirmed that we faced the same challenges in realizing the vision behind the NSDI. The problem is that creating data is getting easier and easier. So it's easier for organizations to go their own way than to collaborate in the context of a larger picture. The problem of duplicate data creation and related inefficient use of public funds are real. Then there is also the massive investment in data creation going on in the private sector. At the same time, we are running out of time to put in place the geospatial foundations needed to support our 21st century problems: designing for new infrastructure, developing more resilient communities in the face of climate change, emergency response and recovery, and preparing for or responding to public health threats, to name a few. Returning to my own state, the authoritative foundational record of Massachusetts municipal boundaries, an effective parcel standard, and let's not overlook the importance of millions of dollars in funding for parcel mapping, and engagement with local government stakeholders are what made key parts of the spatial data infrastructure shown in this graphic possible. Those of you who saw my presentation at last year's annual conference may recall my message that openly available standardized NSDI layers make doing business, whether private, public, or nonprofit, in Massachusetts easier. The economic benefits are real. Based on my experience in Massachusetts, I truly believe that we aren't going to realize those benefits without standards, best practices, governance that involves all stakeholders, and openly available data. The Geospatial Data Act passed in 2018. One of its primary purposes was to improve the coordination and use of geospatial data. The GDA provides a framework for enabling foundation building. It acknowledges and calls for governance for the NSDI data themes. We know how to do the foundational work of standards and best practices. However, history suggests that without collaborative governance that successfully engages stakeholders, including all levels of government, realizing the vision behind the NSDI will remain elusive. Work on governance will necessarily involve groups such as the Federal Geographic Data Committee, the National Geospatial Advisory Council, and professional organizations representing their members' interests. Leadership from members of these groups and organizations is key. However, I suggest that individually, we also each have a role. We need to support relevant foundation building in our areas of influence. We need to educate our local government and state professional organizations about the NSDI and its benefits, about the role of federal agencies and national organizations, and about the role of state and local governments. We also need to help them understand the extraordinary mapping work being done by private companies and the potential for partnerships and related work on standards. We should share some history with them and help them understand the larger picture, the one beyond the confines of specific jurisdictions and specific needs, the one that involves the hard work of standards, the minutiae of coordination, and the compromises of collaboration. That's foundation building work for which our descendants will thank us. Thank you.
Questions for Neil? Any questions online or in the room for Neil? Thanks, Karen. Nope.
Thank you, Neil. Thanks. This is Karen from Wyoming. Thanks for that, trip down memory lane and the good refresher of how we got here. How do you think the compendium with which you are familiar, that document and others like it that we hope to get digital can be leveraged with GDA implementation and working with, the collaborative governance that we're talking about?
Yeah, interesting question. The compendium in question is a document that has a history of GIS, state level GIS development, I believe, for every state in the country. It's a really interesting document. It's really well done. And I haven't had the opportunity to look through the whole thing to compare what happened in different states. But my guess is you'll see some threads there involving successes around particularly governance, but probably other aspects of what I've just talked about as well. I look forward to having a chance to look at that doc in close up. Frank.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Thanks, Neil. I can't help but then flip the timeline forward and what a responsibility we have to think about the work we do and people using it to have a snapshot of our world, that when they're using it 200 years in the future for posterity. We've done a lot of historic mapping around the impacts of Superstorm Sandy, and we're on the brink of more big changes. And it's kind of heightens our awesome responsibility as an industry for posterity.
Well, I think this is at the core of what I had to say, which is and it's hard to do this, but when you're building something, do it right, and maybe at the level of a little bit more than you think needs to be done, right? Do it the way you'd want it to be done if you had to work with it 100 years from now.
Thanks, Neil. Jamie, is there any questions online?
Yes, we do have a question, and I can go ahead and read it. It's, I believe, from Matt Peters. What if we as states focused on a goal of having every agency in our state use GIS at some level? If we reach that, I believe we then have truly reached a worthy goal. Any reaction to that, Neil? Thank you.
Come on, Neil, lay it down.
I didn't hear that. So, yeah, I think that's an entirely worthy goal because, of course, a lot of what I'm talking about is only going to happen if people are engaged in the tools and see what the tools can do. And once they do that, they're going to be much more receptive to the bigger picture stuff, right? Pretty much everybody works in a very siloed environment. You've got your particular task to do. You've got KPIs you're trying to hit. You're busy, and so on and so forth. And unless you have something that breaks you out of kind of the pressure of getting today's tasks done to see that bigger picture, you're not going to be too receptive to that message about what you do as part of some greater good.
Yeah, I really feel like that is a real key for us as GIS professionals, is to realize that we need to kind of get out of our little lane or whatever, and we need to figure out how to spread the love across the whole of government and make it so each agency, even though they won't use GIS every day, but they will use sometimes, and just to bring it to their forefront of their mind to say, this is a possibility, and you can ask these questions and we can answer these questions. I think we've truly succeeded as GIS professionals.
Yeah, and I mean, some of these, a couple of the graphics that you saw today, I've shared with County Assessing Association meetings, right? That's what I'm talking about. And you may have to make several trips, well, two. In other words, if they hear it once, yeah, okay. But if they keep hearing it, and as GIOs or equivalent, we are often in a position to respond to requests for being a speaker at an event, right? And that's the opportunity. You often have a lot of flexibility about what exactly you're talking about. And it may be that you want to talk to them about a particular standard. So in my case, it would have been the parcel standard and the parcel mapping project. But I typically use that as an opportunity to say a little bit about the larger picture. And I have a list of a slide that lists benefits to local government of a standardized parcel mapping. And there are benefits.
Yeah, there are a lot of benefits.
Yeah.
Maybe that's worth posting on my NSDI to remind everyone.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's important, and thank you. It's a good reminder for all of us, right?
Yeah.
This is why we do this, give back to our communities.
Yeah.
Any other questions, Jamie? Do you have anybody else online?
Nope, no one else, just some good links in the chat.
Excellent.